Hello, I'm Steve Hedlund, Communications and Events Manager at the Global Aquaculture Alliance. So GAA announced recently that it's relaunching its signature goal conference, featuring a hybrid experience with a series of virtual events leading up to an in-person event in Seattle. Now, this approach builds upon the virtual event that GAA organized last October, featuring 10 sessions and about 15 hours of content over the course of 4 days. One of those 10 sessions was chaired by our very own Jamie Wright, editor of GAA's Global Aquaculture Advocate online magazine. His session was titled To the Extremes, Plotting Aquaculture's Land-Based and Offshore Trajectories. Speakers included representatives of Atlantic Sapphire, Nordic Aqua Farms, the Kingfish Company, Blue Ocean Mariculture, Ocean Era, and Pan Ocean Aquaculture. So Jamie, I'd like you to kick things off by asking you, what were the main takeaways from your Goal 2020 session?
Thanks, Steve. I would say the main two takeaways were, one, that aquaculture is highly adaptive, and two, it's more investable than ever. So there's a reason why the session had the title that it did, which was in short, To the Extremes. Farming fish many miles out to sea or putting salmon farms on land, each one of these extreme solutions requires a level of engineering that was once considered unthinkable, practically and financially. You know, a big reason why each technology exists and is getting so much attention is because they each address environmental concerns that critics of the industry have been focused on for years. An offshore farm, by definition, is located miles offshore where property owners can't see them. It's located in deeper waters where there are swifter currents. Thus, the impacts of the farm, whether it's uneaten feeds falling to the seafloor or fish effluent, they are far less acute than if the farm was located in a protected bay or inlet close to land. And in many ways, RAS farms are designed to reduce environmental impact altogether. RAS and the flow-through system that Quarry Arctic is building now in Norway offer a level of control that mitigates environmental risk, and that's really the whole point. These structures, whether they're weather-resistant submersible sea stations or RAS facilities on land, are expensive and they take some years to develop. So without sufficient levels of investment capital, these new production paradigms just aren't possible. That they're now taking off, RAS in particular, is a sign that investors aren't really afraid of this industry any longer. They see it as a safer investment and even as an environmental and social responsibility play. Okay.
Now, Jamie, as I mentioned in the introduction, we're trying to build upon what we discussed in past goals. And in April, you're chairing the first of a series of virtual events. So what one issue would you focus on in 2021 that perhaps in retrospect didn't get as much consideration as you wish it had in 2020 or in any previous years? I guess what I'm trying to say is, what's developed over the past past 6 or 7 months that you'd like to address in April?
Well, this hasn't really been by design necessarily, but we've had the aquaculture investment community play a key role at Goal on odd years since 2017. If you recall, when we were in Dublin, we introduced the aquaculture world, or our aquaculture world, to the business accelerator now known as Hatch Blue. Karsten Chrome and his team were able to put on their very first demo day with 4 startup pitches right there at Croke Park. And the room was jam-packed. 2 years later, when we visited Chennai, we had the entire Aquaspark team come and participate in plenary and breakout presentations. We really drilled into the economic activity that is the backdrop for all these new innovations that we've been introduced to over the past few years. So this year, my session will kind of take up that again. We'll start the investment conversation again, and we'll take a deep dive into what I'm calling emerging technologies and the pathways to market that each one has to take. Really trying to rally that startup spirit that generates a lot of excitement. Now, having a great gadget, a website, or another service is one thing, but getting market uptake is another. So we'll definitely dig into that. This year's keynote address will center on what is known as foundational deep technology. So these are truly disruptive innovations. Think silicon microchips and the calculating speed and power that they brought to personal computers and now everyday devices. So the consumer electronics angle there is a hint of what's to come. So if you want to know what foundational deep technology really means, become a GAA member and put April 15 on your calendar. And not coincidentally, our friends at Hatch Blue and Aquaspark will be joining me as guest hosts. So I'm really looking forward to that.
All right, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. Finally, you had a pretty distinguished panel of speakers at Goal 2020 who spoke pretty openly about the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. I was hoping you could single out one series of comments here that resonated with yourself as well as with our audience. Please cue it up. What are we about to watch?
Well, I'd like to first thank all of the speakers that joined us back in October. They brought a lot of expertise and gave generously of their time, and I thank them all. But in the clip that I've selected, you will hear from the one and only Neil Sims of the Kampachi Company in Hawaii. He is a pioneer and one of aquaculture's greatest ambassadors. And in this spot, he talks about offshore aquaculture's prospects. Spoiler alert, he's bullish. So Sims hits upon a point that both panels discussed at length, which is social license. In simpler terms, it's the goodwill of the community that allows an industry to operate. Sims argues that offshore technology is something that environmental NGOs, policymakers, and consumers are now behind as they gain a better understanding of aquaculture and how it compares to terrestrial agriculture. And when you compare the two and you think of efficient protein production, feed conversion, greenhouse gas emissions, or really any other metric you can choose. So play it.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. Okay, let's play the clip.
Well, you mentioned Atle Ida, chairman of Salmar, who addressed our audience on day one. I'm going to skip right to that question. And he talked about his company and his country's potential growth trajectories should offshore aquaculture really take off. Now, Norway produced about 1.33 million metric tons last year, but is eyeing 5 million metric tons by 2050. 70% of that growth, he predicted, would come from offshore farms. That's a roughly tripling the compound annual growth rate of the industry. Do you share this bullish outlook? Maybe that's not possible in all places, but what is your outlook for the entire industry moving offshore and its potential? Neil?
Yeah, I think it comes back to this imperative that I think we all feel that we absolutely have to be doing this. And I think as there is growing awareness amongst the policymakers and consumers about the environmental imperatives that are driving this, that there is going to be a lot more support. And this is becoming abundantly apparent now amongst the environmental NGOs that are now being a lot more vocal in their support of aquaculture generally, but also offshore aquaculture. And this is some of the leading NGOs such as WWF and Conservation International and the Nature Conservancy. And recently there was the UN high-level panel on climate and the oceans that had one of their 5 major recommendations was that we need to transition from terrestrial agriculture towards more marine-based food production systems. So I think that there is going to be a lot more support for this industry and for this growth that we need. And so we won't be bumping up against these social license limitations that have been the primary constraint to growth to date.